Welcome back to a Book a Day podcast. And as you know, this week, instead of picking one book each time in each podcast, what we are doing is we have just got one book with us and we are narrating the stories from that book. The book is none other than the Bible. And what I'm doing here is I'm narrating some interesting biblical stories to give you a fair idea about what happens in the Bible. So far, we have reached to the point of the Great Flood and Noah, with the help of his ark, which was, thanks to God, Jehovah, otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So he survives that. He survives the flood along with his family, his animals, and let's continue from there. In case you haven't really heard the previous part, I would suggest you do that because you'll get the idea of how we get to the point of from Adam and Eve's story to the Great Flood. And now, following the flood, I'll continue the story from here. So what happens is, once Noah and his family, they survive, as an act of gratitude, Noah makes an offering or a gift to the God. And what did he offer? He offered his animals to thank God. I'm sure there was no consent involved there, but that's how it was. And God was pleased, for sure. So what God did was, he promised Noah that he would never destroy the world again. And to mark that promise, he indicated something. So God created a rainbow, and it did so that it could serve as a reminder to people that God would never destroy the world again. And it's a promise that God has made. So that's what happens right after the Great Flood and survival of Noah. Now, many years pass. Many years go by. Noah's family, of course, now it had expanded further. So once again, of course, there were incest and relationships between the family members. There were marriages. And thank God the family expanded. Because then the human race could spread and you could have different gene pool. Otherwise, we would have got stuck in the same thing again, in the same loop where there was just one family and they kept marrying and had children with one another. The idea then was to populate the entire earth. That's what God had asked Noah to do. So as the family expanded, we learn about more characters, more people coming to the picture. And one of these people was a great grandson of Noah, and he was called Nimrod. He was a really bad man. He hunted and killed both animals and people. And Nimrod also made himself a king to rule over other people. And he did those things, those immoral things. And for that reason, God did not really like Nimrod. By the way, at that time, all the people, they spoke just one language. And one could really build one empire. At that time, population wasn't that great, diversity wasn't huge. And seeing that, Nimrod had an idea that he wanted all those people to stay together and he wanted to rule all of them. So you know what he did? He told his people to build a city and a big tower in it. And they started building tower. But God was not really happy with this act. Because what those people and Nimrod, they were doing, what the idea was, to build a city and tower to, have a huge pride in themselves. They wanted to reach the heavens with the help of the tower. They wanted to be famous, get that pride, and God really didn't like it, and He interfered in it. What did He do? He magically caused people to speak different languages. So the men that were building that tower, suddenly they found themselves speaking different languages and nobody could understand the other. And not just the workers, the builders, nobody could understand each other. And this is how, or this is why rather, the city came to be called Babel or Babylon, which meant confusion. So, tormented by this new confusion, a lot of these people, instead of working for the tower, they stopped working on it and they moved away from Babel, and they made different groups of people who were speaking the same languages, and they moved to different parts of the earth. And now we get to the story of Abraham, who is an important prophet in the biblical tradition and important figure for Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So, one of the places where people went to live after the flood, it was called Ur. And Ur became an important city with some really nice houses, the architecture, the lifestyle there was pretty good, but an odd thing was happening over there. Those people over there, they were worshipping some false gods, and our God, Jehovah, He didn't really like it. Also, it's important to mention at this point that around 350 years after the flood, Noah had died. And just 2 years after that, one important person was born, whose name was Abraham. And he lived with his family in the city of Ur. And he was a good man, he was close to God. So one day Jehovah, the God, told Abraham, "Leave your city Ur and your relatives and go to a country that I will show you." So what did Abraham do? He followed the God's command and he did exactly what he was told. And he leaves the house, and after a while he comes to a place or a land called Canaan, and from there we get the term Canaanites, right? So when he reaches there, then God says, "This is the land that I will give to you and your children." And now you know which land we are talking about here. Yes, this was the land that we today know as Israel and Palestine. Of course, it goes beyond those current borders, but this area was pretty much similar. And that's how the name Canaanites, that many Arabs and Israelis, they refer themselves to as. So that's where it comes from. Now, continuing with Abraham's story, God began to help Abraham in his new home, and so that he could have new flocks of sheep and other animals and different servants. He could have good life. Unfortunately, though, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they didn't have a child of their own. So when Abraham was 99 years old and God said to him, "I promise that you will become father to many nations of people," that came as a surprise, because how could that happen when Abraham and Sarah didn't have a child? So that seemed impossible, but Abraham kept believing in God and his powers. And what happened was, 1 year passes by And when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah, his wife, 90 years old, finally they had a baby boy, and he was called Isaac. God had kept his promise. But there was another twist in the story. When Isaac had grown somewhat older, God tested Abraham's faith once again. He called Abraham and he said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, and go to a mountain that I will show you. There, kill your son and offer him up as a sacrifice." Obviously, this shocked Abraham. He loved his son very much, and he didn't know how to do that. But at the same time, he believed in God, and he had made his promise, and it was a difficult choice. But he knew that he had to obey God. So he decided to go ahead with it. And when he got to the mountain, Abraham he tied up his son Isaac and put him on the altar that he had built. Then he took out the knife to kill his son. But just right there, at that precise moment, God's angel comes and says, "Abraham, don't hurt the boy or do anything to him. Now I know that you have believed in God, you have that faith, and this is a gift from God. You can keep your boy." Well, so that was sorted. And now Abraham had his son, Isaac, and life went on. Now we have another character in the story, is called Lot. Lot and his family, they lived together with Abraham in the land of Canaan. One day, Abraham says to Lot, "There's not enough land here for us and our animals, so please let's just separate. If you go one way, then I'll go the other way." Lot looked over the land. He saw a really nice part of the land which had water, green grass, and everything looked nice over there. So this was the district of Jordan. Lot moves there with his family and animals and makes his home over there in the city of Sodom. Unfortunately, the people of Sodom were not very good. They were very unpleasant. And this upset Lot because he was a good man. So God felt for Lot and he wanted to help him. So he sent his two angels to warn Lot that God had decided to destroy Sodom and the nearby city of Gomorrah because people were not really behaving well over there. So pretty much the same story that happened with Noah happens with Lot. God asks him to take his wife, his sons and daughters, only daughters, there was no son, to get out of there and just move out and protect themselves. And they were also warned that once you get out and once you get out and you run, you don't look back, just run. Don't look back, otherwise you will be killed. So they were running, disasters were happening all around them, but they kept running and they didn't look back. But Lot's wife, she disobeyed, and after running for a distance, she looked back. And it happened what was said by the God. She succumbed there and became a pillar of the salt. Now, let's come back to the other story, to the family of Abraham. Abraham, he wanted his son to have a good wife, and he was looking for his marriage, but he didn't want to marry any of the women from Canaan because he thought that these people were worshipping false gods and it was not a good idea to marry one of them. So Abraham called his servant one day and said, I want you to go back to where my relatives live in Haran and get a wife for my son, Isaac. Immediately, Abraham's servant, he took some camels and made that long journey. There he met Abraham's relatives and there he met Rebekah. And he talked to her family and talked about the marriage prospects, and they agreed, and so did she. So she comes to Isaac's house, the couple meet, and they start a new life there. They get married and they start their lives. And then they have twin sons, Esau and Jacob. These two boys, twins though they were and looked alike, they were very different in terms of their personalities. The father, Isaac, he liked Esau a lot because he was really an active guy, good hunter, and he brought a lot of food for the family. And Rebecca, on the other hand, she loved Jacob more because he was really a quiet and peaceful guy. And when these twins were 15 years old at that time, Abraham finally dies at the age of 175. Once again, we continue with the story of the family, and when Esau was 40 years old, he married two women from the land of Canaan. And this made his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, very sad because the same idea that they didn't worship Jehovah, they worshipped false gods. But then one day something happened that made Esau very angry with his brother Jacob. He was supposed to receive some blessing from his parents, certain gifts, but he didn't. Instead, his brother Jacob, he received. And that made Esau really angry. And he was so angry and furious that he wanted to kill Jacob. And when his parents saw that behavior, particularly his mother Rebecca, she was now really worried. She told her husband that it'll just be terrible if Jacob also does the same and marries one of these women of Canaan. At that point, Isaac called his son Jacob and told him, do not marry a woman from Canaan. Instead, go to the house of your grandfather and marry one of the daughters of a man from that place. Jacob listened to his father, and right away he begins his long trip to where his relatives lived. So when he gets there, he meets this woman called Rachel, and they really like each other. But her father had one condition, that he said that he loved his daughter very much, and Jacob had to stay there for 7 years, work there in the fields, and then only he could marry his daughter to Jacob. Jacob agreed. He stayed there for 7 years, but you know what happened then? Instead of marrying Rachel to Jacob, what the father does is he marries off his older daughter, Leah, to Jacob. Obviously, Jacob is troubled by this and he asks question. So the father once again says that work 7 more years and then you can marry the other daughter also. So then he works there for 7 more years, then he marries the other daughter also. So he has 2 wives, and you can understand this is going to be a big family, and it was. Jacob, he had 12 sons, and he had daughters too. Initially, he didn't have a child with Rachel, but after a while, she gives birth to a son, and the son was called Joseph. And he'll come in the story, and probably you're already aware about him. And he's again an important character in the biblical narrative. And then the family, they go back to Canaan, and there Rachel, she gives birth to another child. He was called Benjamin, and during childbirth she dies. But the family continues to live on, and remember, these 12 sons were very important, because these 12 sons of Jacob, in a way, the whole nation of Israel came from them. These were the 12 tribes of Israel. So they came from 10 sons of Jacob and 2 sons of Joseph. Isaac, he lived for many years after all these boys were born, and obviously he was quite happy about it. But there was a granddaughter too, Dinah, who gets into trouble. Now let's see what happens with her. One day she was going to see some of the girls who lived in the land of Canaan. And she goes to meet some of the girls in the Canaan. But what happens there is, one man, he kind of misbehaves with her. And when Dinah's brothers, they find out, they become really angry, and they take out their swords and they go into the city, and they start attacking the man who had misbehaved with their sister. And eventually they rather killed the culprit. Now when Jacob hears this story, he gets really angry, because what his sons really did, that was not a good thing to do. But how did all this trouble started? It was because Dinah tried to make friends with the people of Canaan, and she did not listen to God's advice. And then on the other hand, Joseph also gets into trouble. What happens is, his brothers, they sell him to some of these men who are on their way to Egypt. And that means that Joseph will now be made a slave. So Joseph is only 17 years old when he's taken down to Egypt. There, he's sold to a man who works for the king of Egypt, or we call Pharaoh. So he starts serving his master there. But then what happens is, one of these days, the master's wife, she tries to seduce him, and Joseph resists. So she falsely accuses him of misbehaving and harassing her. So what happens then? Joseph is convicted and he is put into a prison. Now 2 years pass and Joseph is still in prison. Then one night, Pharaoh has 2 very special dreams, and he wonders what they mean. So he calls his wise men and tells them the things that he has seen in his dreams. But they are not able to tell the meaning of the dreams. So at that point, one of his cupbearers who had had this conversation with Joseph in the prison related to dreams, he says that I saw this man in the prison who could tell the meaning of the dreams. And Pharaoh then invites Joseph, and he brings him out of the jail and invites him to help him interpret his dreams. He says, I saw 7 fat, beautiful cows. Then I saw very thin ones, 7 cows, but very thin and skinny ones. And the thin ones, they eat up the fat cows. What does that mean? Also, he says, in my second dream, I saw 7 heads of full ripe grain growing on one stalk. Then I saw 7 thin, dried out heads of grain. And the thin heads of grain began to swallow up the 7 good heads of grain. To that, Joseph says to Pharaoh, the 2 dreams mean the same thing. The 7 fat cows and 7 full heads of grain mean 7 years. And the 7 thin cows and the 7 thin heads of grain mean 7 more years. There will be 7 years when a lot of food will grow in Egypt, and then there will be 7 more years when there will be very little food to grow. So Joseph tells Pharaoh, choose a wise man and put him in charge of collecting food during these 7 good years, so that the people won't starve in the following 7 bad years when there will be very little food. Pharaoh, he appreciates and likes the idea, and he chooses Joseph to collect the food and store it up and plan accordingly. So now, next to Pharaoh, Joseph becomes the most important man in Egypt. And 8 years later, there's a famine. And Egypt is doing pretty well because Joseph has taken care of everything. So people from different parts of the land, they come to Egypt and they seek help. And some of these men, they look familiar to Joseph. Who were they? They were his 10 older brothers, and he remembers that they had sold him off as slave. But Joseph is not really a bad man. He's a good man. He wants to help his brothers, but he just wants to know if they are still mean and are they still unkind, or have they learned their lesson. So he tries to test them. And so he says, you all are spies and you've come to our country to sabotage and loot it. But no, we are not, they say. We are honest men. We are all brothers. We were 12, but one brother is no more, and the youngest one is at home with our father. They can't notice that they can't recognize him because he's grown older and the appearance has changed, so they can't really recognize that it's their brother right in front of their eyes. And Joseph, he pretends not to believe them. So what he does is, he says, I'm going to keep one of your brothers here, and the rest of you will go back, take the food with you, and just come back with your youngest brother, and then you will have this brother, his life will be spared too. So they follow his command, and they bring the youngest brother Benjamin. Now, at this point, Joseph really tests them. What he does is, he has his servants fill up all their bags with food. But without letting them know, he also has his special silver cup put into Benjamin's bag. And after they all leave and have gone a little distance on the road, Joseph sends his servants after them. And when they catch up, the servants say, why have you stolen our master's silver cup? And they say, we have not stolen his cup. If you find the cup with any one of us, you can kill that person or all of us. So the servants, they search through all the bags, and eventually they find the cup in Benjamin's bag. And the servants now say, the rest can go, but we will definitely have to arrest Benjamin, and you know what will happen to them. But at this point, the brothers decide not to abandon their youngest brother, and they say, no, we'll stay with him, we'll not let him go. And at that point, Joseph knows that they have changed and they have learned their lesson. And now Joseph cannot control his feelings, his emotions any longer. He tells all his servants to leave the room, and when he's all alone with his brothers, he begins to cry. And he tells them, I am Joseph. And just tell me, is my father still alive? Now the brothers are surprised and they feel emotional too. And now the family reunion happens. They all decide to go back to meet their father and they reunite all together. There were 70 when they moved to Egypt, including Jacob and his children and grandchildren. And after that, they all settled in Egypt and they were called Israelites because God had changed the name of Jacob to Israel. And the Israelites, they become very special people to God. So that's how the origin of Israel comes from. So now a new life begins for them in Egypt. They're working next to Pharaoh. And as you know, Joseph was the most important man in Egypt next to Pharaoh. But then Joseph died. And then came a new Pharaoh who did not really like the Israelites. In fact, he was really a mean person and probably really bad person. He was so bad that what he did was he made all the Israelites his slaves and he put men in charge of them that were really mean and cruel. These men, they forced the Israelites to work very hard building the cities for Pharaoh and do all the labor job. And that continued, but despite that, the Israelites, they kept growing in numbers, and because of that, the Egyptians, they grew insecure that they might become minority. That's again an issue that you find in today's geopolitics as well. So at that point, Pharaoh does something really horrible. He spoke to the women who helped the Israeli mothers when they were giving birth to these babies, that what you must do, you must kill every baby boy that is born and only let the baby girls live. That was his command. And probably this might sound familiar to you. This is when we get to the story of Moses, which we'll discuss in the next podcast. Keep listening.